Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time, coming to you live from Washington. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific, of course.
Good, good. So we have another terrific week ahead of us, and the news has been exciting. But before we go to the news, let's welcome all our viewers watching us live here on Facebook. To you all, we say keep those comments coming, and we are here for you today. Shaka is ready to take your questions. Shaka, let's maybe start off on a sad note here. Let's start in Kenya. One of Kenya's leading opposition leaders, this guy, Kenneth Matiba, was a remarkable gentleman who passed away earlier this week. He played so many roles as a political figure, opposition leader. He was incarcerated or locked up for a very long time because he was opposed to the Moi regime. Maybe bring us up to speed. Who was this guy?
You know, like you said, he was an incredible guy. He was a guy that, in many ways, whatever he touched, frankly, seemed to turn into gold. I mean, he was a man that was probably among Kenya's very few graduates before independence. He was a high school teacher in the 1960s. And then he became a senior official in the then Ministry of Education. And when Kenya became independent, he became permanent secretary. And eventually he went into business. He used to be the managing director of what used to be called the East African Breweries. And eventually he built huge businesses, my friend. This guy was so rich. He was one of the few really indigenous first Kenyan millionaires, if you will.
How did he get his money?
He did actually business, legitimate business. Like I said, not politics. He actually had shares in hotels, for example. He had a chain of hotels called Alliance Hotels, which even had some facilities in Mombasa, in Ukunda, those kind of stuff. I remember, in fact, sometimes interviewing him via telephone link-up when he was in one of those hotels. He had schools. He was a kid from Mulanga. And eventually, of course, he worked his way into politics. When he went into politics, he became a cabinet minister. And he was a very successful minister. In fact, I remember a young Kenneth Matiba meeting a young Muhammad Ali himself in the 1980s, when Muhammad Ali had actually been sent to Africa to persuade the African countries not to attend the Moscow Olympics, the 1980. And this was also a man who became a manager of football. Some of the major football, teams or clubs or what have you were in some ways associated with a man called Kenneth Matiba. He was everything you could think about. And he was a man, by the way, when he served as a cabinet minister, reports say, and they are actually justified, that he never actually took a salary. He didn't take a salary. This was a man who was rich, who was very comfortable in his skin, and yet who was a champion, frankly, for making sure that ordinary people, got some kind of socio-economic justice. He even resigned his cabinet position to go and actually fight the one-party state, so that he eventually became one of the champions, frankly, for fighting for the restoration of multi-politics or multi-party democracy in Kenya in the early 90s.
But that didn't go down very well, especially trying to crack down the very strong KANU party in Kenya. It didn't go very well for him, just like any other opposition politician practicing in Africa.
Well, that was, I guess, expected, especially you had a one-party state, in that particular, at that particular moment. But in the end, even though he had actually been detained in so many places, including Kamiti, one of the, I think, maximum prisons in Kenya. Guess what? Eventually, December 1991, he won, because Parliament eventually had to make law they had to make sure that they repeal the law that justified the one-party state, and eventually Kenya became a multi-party type of political society, which ushered in the first multi-party election in December 1992, which I was very, very fortunate and very honored, by the way, to cover from downtown Nairobi for the Voice of America.
Interesting. Let's move along. Let's talk about another legendary woman who passed away last week, Winnie Mandela, who was laid to rest over the weekend. She was also an incredibly talented person, a freedom fighter, you could argue. But along the way, she also ran into trouble with the law and, of course, being harassed by the apartheid regime. What do you say about Winnie Mandela?
The only thing I can say, Paul, is I was moved by what I saw over the weekend. I'm talking about Saturday, which culminated into a 10-day, you could say, state funeral, really. You remember that, for example, the South African flags, you're talking about the national flag, was at half-mast for 10 days. I don't recall any other person, really, who has had that kind of honor, or who has been so honored. She was expected also to receive a 21-gun salute, which is normally reserved for heads of state. I don't know, I've not found any record to suggest that she actually did, but she was expected to be honored by that. I saw, for example, more than 40,000 people gathered in Soweto, Orlando Stadium, which is very near her home, where I had the opportunity to stop by for a courtesy call back in 2009. I saw President Cyril Ramaphosa give a very moving eulogy. And I also saw my friend Hage Geingob, the president of Namibia, being one of the few sitting African presidents who found time to go to South Africa and honor Mama Winnie Mandela. And it was very interesting because Mr. Ramaphosa said that Mr. Hage Geingob, president of Namibia, told him that as a young man, he had actually played football in that particular stadium back in 1962 when he had just about, become of age to fight the same thing, colonialism. South Africa was, of course, the master of Namibia because Namibia was what became a League of Nations mandate and eventually United Nations mandate before it became independent in the early 1990s.
Interesting. I also saw a group of a delegation from here, including Reverend Jesse Jackson. People looked at Winnie Mandela from a totally different lens, especially when you talk to civil rights leaders here, she rose to that level of being a civil rights leader in South Africa. Would you agree?
You're right, and you can also talk about a British black great model, Naomi Campbell, who was also there and in fact was given an opportunity to also to essentially say some things about Winnie Mandela, because she happened to be a very close family of Winnie Mandela and the late Matiba, Nelson Mandela.
Let's move along. Earlier, we were talking about, maybe let me first go to a Facebook comment here. Let's go to Chinire Ezifi, one of the few women who have reached out to us today. She's from Lagos, and she wants to know, will the good people of Africa hold their public officers accountable rather than being held accountable by them? Maybe I can tie that to what's happening here in the United States. You have a situation whereby the President of the United States, his lawyer, and their lawyers are fighting the system. The President of the United States is fighting his own Justice Department. Maybe what that means is this is a nation of laws. It's governed by the rule of law. But we have situations in Africa where you have people who don't really, who don't pay attention to some of these things or governed by the rule of law. It's, in other words, you can say maybe these are nations that are run by men, strong-willed men. But here in this particular case, you have a system fighting its own, the president fighting his own system. Maybe speak more to that.
Of course, when you look at what you call, quote-unquote, mature democracy, you're talking about societies of laws, really. A society that is run on the basis of laws. But when you talk about countries which are still really in the stage of what I would describe as undemocratic, you know, then you're talking about societies that are run not on the basis of law, but societies, in fact, that are run on the basis of men or women. But for the most part, since Africa is very patriarchal, you're talking about societies that are run, in fact, on the basis of men. They are societies of men, not laws. When you talk about laws, that one is only on paper and is pretty much in theory, but in terms of practice, you don't have citizens in most African countries. You actually have people who, on paper again, in terms of theory, yes, they are citizens, in which case they actually owe allegiance to the state, not the individual authority. And because they owe their allegiance to the state, it means that they actually have constitutional rights. They have constitutional rights, you could even say inalienable rights, or even birth rights, in fact, for that matter. Yeah. But what they have not been able to do is to assert those rights so that they actually become legitimate citizens who are in charge of the affairs of their country, and in which case a president or an ambassador or a cabinet minister and what have you, in fact, happens to be their employee, not the employer. They are the masters, in other words, of their society. But in reality, they have not been able to express that. Yeah. Now, for the question from my sister from Lagos to be answered, we need to talk about the role of civil society organizations. What is needed are civil society organizations. You're talking about religious, for example, groupings. You're talking about labor union or trade unions. You're talking about the media and what have you. You're talking about people that are beneficiaries, really, of civic education, to tell them, or at least give them the idea, the necessary information that suggests, not only suggests, by the way, that tells them precisely the kind of power that they have, not to behave as subjects, because a subject does not have any constitutional rights. A subject has essentially privileges which are granted to you by the individual authority who happens to be in power. It can be a kabaka, it can be an emperor, it can be a presidential monarch. And so what we are looking at, in fact, in Africa, the reason we have what is happening in most of Africa is precisely people do not look at themselves in reality as citizens. They look at themselves as subjects because they actually feel or think that they owe allegiance in an individual authority. And it is that individual authority who in turn grants you privileges, not rights.
Yeah, interesting. Let's move along. Let's go to another Facebook commenter from Miro Charles. He says, does any African leader deserve to be in power more than 2 terms? I think it's along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what kind of leader you are talking about. If you have a parliamentary system, for example, you don't have to worry about term limits. But that is also if, in fact, you have a society which is largely educated, which is largely, especially socially and politically conscious, and therefore it knows exactly what its role is. It carries out periodic elections, which are not simply elections in terms of selections, but in fact elections which are credible, which are transparent, which are free, fair, and verifiable, where you actually have a result that reflects the will of the voter, the will of the people, so that you can elect, for example, a political party or a coalition of political parties which come together and choose a prime minister who becomes the head of a government and serves for that particular term. It can be 5 years, and if he does well and what have you, his party does well, they can go back to the people, have an election, and therefore get a renewed mandate. So you don't have to worry about that, because if I may in fact go to a country like Singapore, you had the founding leader there who was a man called Lee Kuan Yew. He actually governed Singapore, the city-state, for 31 years. But the good thing about Lee Kuan Yew is not that he simply talked the talk about development. He actually walked the talk about development, so that Singaporeans, in fact, walked the talk. They walked the walk to the extent that he helped to develop that country, which was a third world country, underdeveloped. In those 31 years, he lifted it from poverty. He lifted it from the third world status to a first world. And Singapore, as we talk, happens to be one of the few countries, frankly, when you look at the income per capita, it's right there at the top. Singapore, in fact, in many ways, even advises giant countries. When you go around, you shouldn't be surprised if you see a huge Boeing, for example, at Heathrow's London airport, written on Singapore Airlines, that kind of stuff. And arguably one of the best airlines in the world.
Shaka, let me push back for a second here. You talked about a parliamentary system, a presidential system. For example, Ethiopia has had...
Mind you, I have not yet talked about the presidential system.
Okay, let me finish. Ethiopia has had a parliamentary system. It hasn't worked very well for them. As you know, they've been fighting each other. The opposition has been on the streets for years, trying to at least to advocate for democracy. We go to a presidential system. You look at Uganda. We look at Rwanda. All these people claim that they have ushered or they have taken their countries from what used to be like banana republics to modern day economy. In fact, they are aspiring to become even economically viable by maybe 2030. So maybe I want to get your argument on that.
I honestly don't think that you are right on the money, especially when you use Ethiopia as an example. First of all, remember I said that you have to have a society which is reasonably well educated. You have to have a society which is where people are socially and politically conscious, socially and politically aware of their rights. And they have to have the ability to be able to assert those rights. Now, that criteria, frankly, does not fit Ethiopia. First of all, you forget that Ethiopia, for history's sake, it used to be what you would call an empire under emperors until the mid-early 70s, when Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown by Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mengistu Haile Mariam, essentially you had two transitional leaders who were military officers, senior military officers. You had Tafari Bante and you had General Ando. These are people also eventually who were removed by supporters of Mengistu. And Mengistu became not only a military head of state, but became president of Ethiopia until 1991, when he was overthrown by the TPLF, which was led at that time by Meles Zenawi. It is later, when Meles Zenawi takes over in Addis Ababa, that you start a parliamentary system. So you can't actually say that the parliamentary system in Ethiopia has failed. You have to give it time.
Oh, well, how many more years? It's been in power for over 20 years.
Well, you know what? you have to give it time, because right now, you know what has happened. For the first time, probably, I'm sure there are some people who probably wouldn't accept it, but for the first time, most people would agree. You now have a member of the majority ethnic community in Ethiopia, the Oromo, who actually happens to be the prime minister and head of government in Ethiopia. You even have the president, who is ceremonial, yes, who happens to be head of state, who happens to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, even though the reality probably suggests he doesn't actually control the armed forces. But that man also is from Oromia, he's an Oromo. You have the foreign minister, he's an Oromo. There are things that are changing, and the reason they are changing is because the Ethiopians, especially the Oromos, are asserting their rights. They are asserting themselves. The Amhara, they are asserting their rights. You're talking about a society, my brother, which has more than 105 million human beings. It is the second largest, largest country in Africa in terms of population, after Nigeria. When you talk about the people from Tigray, Tigrinya and what have you, they make up about 6%. I agree that for the most part, the formula is